Good morning. The reading today is from the 7th chapter of Luke. When Jesus had finished saying all this to the people, he returned to Capernaum. At that time, the highly valued slave of a Roman officer was sick and near death. When the officer heard about Jesus, he sent some respected Jewish elders to ask him to come and heal his slave. So they earnestly begged Jesus to help the man. "If anyone deserves your help, he does," they said, "for he loves the Jewish people and even built a synagogue for us." So Jesus went with them. But just before they arrived at the house, the officer sent some friends to say, "Lord, don't trouble yourself by coming to my home, for I am not worthy of such an honor. I am not even worthy to come and meet you. Just say the word from where you are, and my servant will be healed. I know this because I am under the authority of my superior officers, and I have authority over my soldiers. I only need to say, 'Go,' and they go, or 'Come,' and they come. And if I say to my slaves, 'Do this,' they do it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed. Turning to the crowd that was following him, he said, "I tell you, I haven't seen faith like this in all Israel." And when the officer's friends returned to his house, they found the slave completely healed. Soon afterward, Jesus went with his disciples to the village of Nain, and a large crowd followed him. A funeral procession was coming out as he approached the village gate. The young man who had died was a widow's only son, and a large crowd from the village was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart overflowed with compassion. "Don't cry," he said. Then he walked over to the coffin and touched it, and the bearers stopped. "Young man," he said, "I tell you, get up." Then the dead boy sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. Great fear swept the crowd, and they praised God, saying, "A mighty prophet has risen among us, and God has visited his people today." And the news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding countryside. Word of God, word of life.
Good morning again, wherever you are watching us from. It's great to have you in worship. If you're just now joining us, I just want to welcome you into this time of worship today. Thank you for tuning in. You are part of our family here at Messiah, regardless of location, regardless of where you are at. We consider everyone who watches us online as a part of our family here at Messiah. You are a part of our worshiping community as well. So welcome. So we, as I said at the beginning of our worship, we are in the middle of a season called Epiphany in the church, and it's a season of light and of revelation. It's a season that we look at who Jesus is and what his ministry is about, right? It is revealed to us. And so we're taking a look at Jesus' early ministry to figure that out. Who was this baby that we celebrated at Christmas? That is the season of Epiphany for us. So I want to start off and I want to ask you to think about a time that you were moved with compassion. All right? Think about one of those moments, okay? And as you try to think about one of those moments, I want to tell you a moment that I was moved with compassion is when I came across this young boy by the name of Delalan in Ethiopia. So for those of you who don't know, about 7 years ago, I started a nonprofit charity organization called Acts of Wisdom. We seek to bring education to children in rural Africa. We believe education of children helps them in their knowledge and helps them go on and to lift themselves out of poverty. It gives them a purpose. It gives them meaning in life. And so that's what we do. On one of my trips about 3 years ago, I think, I ran across Delalan. Delalan had lost both of his parents. He was an orphan. He was living on the streets. He was staying where he could. At the current time, he was actually sleeping in one of the local churches that was there. He was begging on the street. He was not in school, and he was trying to just get food and get whatever he could through the generosity of other people. As I sat and as I saw him, and I asked our guide, Johannes, my brother from another mother, to call him over and so that I could talk with him and find out his story, and that's where I learned all of these things. And as he was telling his story in that moment, I had compassion for him. And Delalan helped actually to spur an idea of an orphan sponsorship program through Acts of Wisdom. He was one of the first ones to enter into the program, one of the first ones to become sponsored through our organization. And so he was the one that really helped to give hope to other kids. Now we have sponsored at least 20 different kids who are in school and continue to be in school. We've had our first 2 graduate from college and are now, one went to technical school and is now starting his job, and we have another one who is now entering into teaching. We're so proud of them. And it really has uplifted the need. There's 22 million children in this world who do not have access to an education. They don't even have access to things such as simple as school books, right? And so what we seek to do is we help to provide for them. Now, I want you to take a look at what 2 years of sponsorship can do for Delalan. This is him today. Big difference, isn't it? He's happy. He is smiling. He is actually at the top of his class. We are really proud of him. He has worked hard. He has food. He has clothing. He has a place to stay. And he has all his school supplies, everything that he needs, and he's going to go on, I guarantee you, to do really great things, and we're super proud of him and the way that he is just kind of stepping up and being a leader now amongst all of our other orphans who are in our program. I tell that story, and I had you think of that moment because when I hear the 2 texts for today, I am struck by 2 focal points of the text that I want to concentrate on that will lead our conversation today. The focal points of 1, that Jesus' ministry is for all people, that it was to the Gentiles. We'll talk about what that means here in just a second. And the topic of compassion, right? Compassion shows up during this text for today. And so I want to talk about those 2 topics for our discussion. Now let's talk about this first story because I think it really lends itself to talk about that first focal point about Jesus' ministry to the Gentiles, right? That first story we heard was about a Roman centurion who was a Gentile. Now, whenever you hear the word Gentile in Scripture, Gentile was always a term used to refer to anyone outside of the Jewish faith, right? It was anyone on the outside. In today's terminology, it would be those people, all right? We've all done it. We've all said it. Those people over there, people that we look down upon, people that we look down our nose at, all right? People who are different than us, right? Those people. So whenever you hear Gentile, in our context, I want you to think about and kind of envision who the world says are Gentiles today. Okay, and so this Roman centurion comes up to Jesus, and he comes up to Jesus on behalf of his sick slave servant, right? Not a family member, right? Not somebody who is under his command, but his slave. He comes to Jesus because his slave is sick, and his faith is so great, all right. Because remember, Jesus wants to come to this man's house. All right? Now, big no-no in that day and age, right? You could not, as a good Jewish person, enter into the faith of a Gentile because you would then be considered unclean. It's one of the reasons why Pontius Pilate has to come out to the courtyard for Jesus' trial when the Pharisees present Jesus to Pilate for crucifixion, right? They couldn't enter into his home. All right, that was the law. And so Jesus was about to go to his house, and this Roman soldier tells him, he says, no, you don't have to come. only speak the word and let my servant be healed. I know, in other words, you don't even have to come to him. I know that by you just saying those words, he will be healed. Jesus kind of looks around at the crowd, and Jesus responds by saying, I have not seen such faith in all of Israel. Now, there are two things in that statement. One, not only is he uplifting the Roman centurion, but he is also rebuking the in crowd, the Jewish people, right? By saying, I haven't seen this type of faith among any of you. Oh, think about that, right? Now, we've touched on this theme of Jesus' ministry to the Gentiles a few weeks back when Jesus preaches in his hometown synagogue, right? He's preaching to them and he says, look, sorry everybody, I haven't come for you. I've come for all of those who are on the outside. I've come for the Gentiles, right? Jesus lays down in that Nazareth sermon in the synagogue, in his place of worship, that he has come for those who are on the outside. Right? And this theme of light for the revelation of the Gentiles will continue to be a theme throughout all of Luke's gospel account. Right? That Jesus, remember, Old Testament covenant was just for the nation of Israel. New Testament covenant, the Messiah would be for all the nations. And that is the focus of Luke's gospel. You will constantly see Jesus reaching out to people who were considered on the outside of the faith. It is a dominant theme. It is one we cannot afford to gloss over when we are looking at the Jesus in Luke's gospel. As a matter of fact, the Sunday after Christmas, Jesus is presented in the temple to the priest Simeon, and he's affirmed by Simeon that he is God's son. And Simeon responds with a song of himself, kind of like Mary's song in Luke chapter 2. He makes reference to Isaiah 49:6 that says this. It says, it is too light of a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and restore the survivors of Israel. I will give you as a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. Listen to that. I will give you as a light to the nations. David Teat says in his commentary, this passage might very well be the thematic statement of Luke's entire narrative. Remember also, this would extend into the book of Acts, because Luke and Acts is one work. It's one document. Acts of the Apostles is a continuation of the narrative of Luke's gospel, right? Written by the same person. It just talks about the Acts of the Apostles after Jesus' resurrection. And look at this. In that portion of the narrative, the writer opens this new chapter of the story of the new narrative in Acts, right where they left off in Luke. We hear Jesus telling the disciples in verse 8, he says, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. In other words, you cannot stay where you are comfortable in Jerusalem. You cannot stay where people look like you in Jerusalem. You cannot stay where people think like you in Jerusalem. You cannot stay in Jerusalem where you have people who think, talk, and act like you do. Jesus tells his disciples, you have got to go beyond that. Start there, all right, because we want to start where we're comfortable, all right? But let me tell you, ministry to people who think, talk, and act like you is just as difficult as people who don't, all right? Drop the wrong name at the dinner table, you'll be quick to find out, right? And Jesus says, your mission is not only to those people who think, talk, and act like you in Jerusalem, your people, right? But your mission is to those who might not think like you, who might not look like you. That's in Judea. But you can't stop there. Jesus tells them you have to go on to Samaria. Your mission is to those who don't look like you, who don't think like you, who don't talk like you. And here we have that light to the nations that we see in Isaiah. That light that all of a sudden this new covenant, the Messiah was going to be for all nations. It's a miracle. I don't understand why people in first century world did not get and had a hard time with Jesus going to those who were on the outside when the prophets even foretold it. Right? And so Jesus is telling them, you have got to go out into the world. You cannot stay here. Brothers and sisters, this is what is called the inclusive character of the gospel. Right? This is what the gospel is about. The gospel is about going beyond where we are comfortable. And that Jesus' love and Jesus' mission is for all people. We are called to be an inclusive church, not an exclusive country club. We are called to be an inclusive church despite what the world tells us. And this is our challenge today. But here we are in the midst of COVID. It has actually, I think, been a blessing for the church because all of a sudden the church now has to reach beyond its four walls and can do that through the wonders of technology. Right? Look, we have people watching us in 14, 15 different states and 8 different countries at Messiah. Right? Suddenly, we can get beyond those walls. But here's the deal, church. Here's what I want you to realize. When we are all able to come back and have some sense of normalcy again, it is not meant to just be solely the job of technology and a pastor to do this work. By Jesus telling his disciples this in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, he is actually telling all disciples in all times and in all places that we must go beyond our comfort zones and bring the message to those who might not think, act, or talk like us, and for those who do not think, act, or talk like us. Right? Because here's the deal. Here's the thing I want you to know. We all come from different places, right? Part of who we are is where we come from. Right? And we can't forget where we come from. And by not forgetting where we come from, guess what? We become the Gentiles in the story. Do you realize that we are the Gentiles in the story? If the disciples did not take this message seriously and carry it to the ends of the earth and to the Gentiles, we might not even be sitting here today. And now that the message is to us, the question is, will we listen? And if we have listened, do we join our old ways of doing things? Do we join the ways of the world? Or do we join the ways of the one whom we follow? The question for the church today is, have we left Jerusalem? Are we willing to leave Jerusalem? Because the gospel texts are very clear, right? This is the inclusive nature of the gospel. We must go beyond our Jerusalems. So then we hear that this story is butted up against a story about a widow's son being brought back from the dead. All right? The story sets up, there's a widow and she lost her son, right? Now, up until now, Jesus has shown his healing power. But with this part of the narrative, Jesus goes a step further by demonstrating his ability to overturn death itself. And notice how this story begins. The story begins in verse 13 that says, when the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her. All right? I'm going to read that again, and then when we get to the word compassion, wherever you are watching us from, I want you to say that word out loud. When the Lord saw her, he had what? Compassion for her. And he said to her, do not weep. Now, compassion is something that we have been lacking. All right? Compassion literally means suffering with. And it was triggered by an empathy for a mother who lost her child. My compassion was triggered by an empathy for this young man who was living on the streets without an education, without parents, who wanted to go to school, who wanted to be someone, who wanted to earn a living and make something of himself. And so Jesus' compassion is triggered by this empathy for a mother who lost her child, because let's face it, as we look at the cycle of life and death, we all know this is one of the most difficult human experiences, right? We think that as the circle of life goes, no parent should have to bury their children. And Jesus also realizes something. What is she? She's a widow. He realizes that having lost her only son and her husband, she's a widow, she is now doubly vulnerable in first century society. As in the patriarchal culture of first century Roman Empire, widows depended upon their sons, brothers, or other male relatives in order to get by. She now has no one. And I see this all the time, these scenes playing out in the rural areas of Ethiopia, where there's still sort of that patriarchal cultural society that we have out in the rural areas. And Jesus is moved to compassion, and that compassion motivates a miracle. Now, it might be worth noting here in the context in which this compassion arises, right? The story depicts two processions that are about to meet at an intersection, right? First, you have Jesus and his disciples and this large crowd who have just celebrated this miracle of life, this slave of this Roman centurion being healed, and they are moving in one direction. And in the opposite direction, you have another procession of death led by a widow and her dead son and the mourning crowd. And as one commentator points out, it is now at the intersection of life meeting death where compassion arises. It is when hope and suffering come together. And here's the deal. Here's why I don't think we totally grasp compassion. Is because we are looking through the wrong lens. Right? We are looking through the wrong lens. And somehow American Christianity has distorted gospel Christianity. American Christianity suddenly says, oh my God, there's that person over there. They don't have health care, they don't have food, they don't have anything because they're lazy and they don't want anything to do. And that person, if I give them money, they're drug addicts and they're alcoholics and they're probably going to use their money to go and just do some of that. And suddenly it's judgmentalism that is in place. And here's the thing. When we have judgment coming together with suffering, we do not get compassion. It is only when we can see hope for a better future. It is only when hope and suffering come together. And that's the difference between the gospel and what we've kind of distorted the faith to be. Judgmentalism, judgment, and suffering, when they come together, they cannot bring about compassion. It is only when hope and suffering come together. And what does this mean for us? Well, I think it means a lot for us. I think it means that Jesus does call us to go beyond our Jerusalems. And when we go beyond our Jerusalems and when we reach out to people who might not think, act, or talk like us, or who do not think, act, or talk like us, when we're there, we meet them with compassion, not with judgment. And real compassion, as embodied by Jesus, runs counter to our culture's constant call to succeed by any means necessary. Real compassion, as embodied by Jesus, runs counter to culture's constant call to think of ourselves first. Real compassion, as embodied by Jesus, runs counter to our culture's constant call to do what you can to impress. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, in the story of the Good Samaritan, where the Good Samaritan actually helps that person who is beaten down on the side of the road. He says, here's the deal. The other two that passed by on the other side, they were thinking in terms of, if I stop to help this guy, what's going to happen to me? But the Samaritan flips the question and says, if I don't stop to help this guy, what's going to happen to him? There's that different thinking, right? Of flipping it between thinking about ourselves first and now thinking about others. Real compassion is a call to suffer with the powerless. Not to judge them, not to tell them what to do before we even know their story, for crying out loud. But it is a call to suffer with the powerless. So I want to leave you today with a quote from Henry Nouwen that says this. He says, compassion means going directly to those people and places where suffering is most acute, and it is building a home there. God's compassion is total, it is absolute, it is unconditional, it is without reserve. So brothers and sisters, may we begin to not only see with our eyes, but maybe we begin to see with our hearts. May we not only begin to hear with our ears, but hear with our hearts. And may we not only begin to love with our hearts, may we begin to love with all of our souls. And to that we say, thanks be to God. In Jesus' name, amen.
Who am I that the highest king would welcome me? I was lost, but he brought me in. Oh, his love for me. Oh, his love for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. Free at last, he has ransomed me. His grace runs deep. While I was a slave to sin, Jesus died for me. Yes, he died for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. a place